This chart tracks global military expenditure against the capital required to meet basic human survival targets. In 2025, world military spending reached $2.887 trillion. That marks an 11th consecutive year of real growth, representing a planetary claim on public resources that outpaces investments in human infrastructure. On the second axis, we see the annual Sustainable Development Goal financing gap stalled at approximately $4 trillion. We can measure exactly what that $4 trillion gap leaves unfunded. The United Nations calculates it would take $93 billion a year to eradicate global hunger by 2030, and $114 billion to provide universal safe drinking water and sanitation in low- and middle-income countries. These are fractions of the current global security budget. We are witnessing a collision between two trends. Capital allocation for threat capacity is expanding reliably, while the metrics for actual human and ecological survival are declining. Dr. Bichara Sahely identifies this misallocation as a conserved civilizational coupling. The current budget outcomes represent the intended performance of a system structured to prioritize financial claims over the living world. To correct this distribution of capital, we have to look past the top-line budget numbers and examine the specific object that our security apparatus is designed to protect. This diagram maps Sahely's macro structure for understanding modern resource allocation, the Midas Mars trap. It illustrates the mechanical pipeline from living resources to militarized enforcement. The first half of the trap is the Midas process. This is the economic mechanism that converts living relations, watersheds, forests, human labor, and ecological capacity into abstract financial claim value. A living forest becomes timber value. A human community becomes a labor pool or consumer segment. The second half is Mars, or militarized asset resource security. Financial claims, like corporate property rights or extractive concessions, require physical enforcement. Mars is the organized deployment of military power, surveillance, and coercive diplomacy specifically to protect those claims. This creates a strict boundary between two concepts of safety. Common defense protects shared life capacity, people, public health, and ecological stability. Mars protects assets, strategic routes, and market access. Both use the vocabulary of security, but they secure entirely different objects. The Midas Mars trap organizes public coercive power and public budgets to guarantee private wealth. The state enforces the claim, private entities extract the value, and the resulting human and ecological costs are externalized onto the public. The baseline for a functioning society is life value. This refers to the actual capacity of living systems to continue and regenerate. It includes soil fertility, clean water, healthcare access, education, and the civil commons. The Midas system abstracts that life value into claim value. These are recognized legal and financial entitlements, property titles, shareholder returns, mineral rights, patents, and debt obligations. That an abstraction cannot physically enforce itself. When a corporation secures an extractive concession, or a financial institution imposes severe debt discipline on a developing nation, local communities and ecosystems often resist the resulting dispossession or contamination. At the point of resistance, the system faces a choice. It can revise or limit the financial claim to accommodate the reality of the living system, or it can force the living system to submit to the financial claim. When the choice is submission, Mars is summoned. Resistance to extraction is reclassified as a security threat. The protection of a financial abstraction requires the application of organized physical violence against the life ground. Macroeconomics typically categorizes national defense spending as a universal public good, assuming that military expenditure benefits all citizens equally by providing a blanket of safety. Economist Mason Gaffney argues that treating a global military footprint as a public good obscures its real function, a taxpayer subsidy protecting private overseas business. Common defense protects the public. Claim protection secures concentrated corporate wealth, while offloading costs like debt and trauma onto the public. We see this structure most clearly in extractive industries and global logistics. Multinational firms secure mineral rights or oil concessions in unstable regions, and shipping conglomerates rely on strategic corridors. The physical security for these operations is provided by state military alliances, bases, and fleets. Gaffney suggests applying a beneficiary pays accounting principle. If a specific military deployment or shipping lane protection directly secures private corporate assets, the corporation should bear the full financial and ecological cost of that protection. Under current accounting, Mars operates as a massive fiscal transfer. It privatizes the profits of global asset extraction while socializing the massive risks, debts, and casualties required to maintain it. If the math proves that the public is paying for a system that degrades their own security to protect private claims, we have to ask why voters reliably consent to the arrangement. Sociologist Johan Galtung answers this by analyzing the gut brain of the body politic. He argues that public consent for militarization often bypasses rational reflection, functioning instead as a collective discharge triggered by subconscious inputs. This flowchart models Galtung's false sequence of military necessity. A geopolitical competitor or a local resistance movement presents simple friction, or opposition. Without reflection, the culture rapidly escalates opposition into enmity. Enmity is labeled evil, and evil justifies annihilation. This rapid escalation is powered by collective trauma and a mythic sense of chosenness. When a society views its economic interests as a sacred civilizational mission, any resistance to its asset claims is easily framed as an irrational, barbaric threat to order itself. This psychological framing makes life-destroying economic allocations feel viscerally righteous, ensuring the voting public will fund the Mars system without demanding an accounting of who actually benefits. But ideology alone cannot sustain a $3 trillion global enterprise. The military-industrial complex persists because it physically provisions the everyday survival of the civilian economy. Joan Roloff's insecurity blanket expands the military-industrial complex across public life. Dependency nodes reach deep. Universities rely on defense grants, municipalities on bases, and pensions on sector returns. This creates captured relevance. When civilian institutions depend on military funding, they become structurally mute, self-censoring critique. This explains a persistent political paradox. Local leaders and labor unions will fiercely defend the expansion of weapons manufacturing in their districts, regardless of their stance on foreign policy, simply because those jobs guarantee housing and healthcare for their constituents. The military-industrial complex is largely immune to pure moral critique because it functions as a load-bearing pillar of economic stability. You cannot easily dismantle a structure if your community is living inside it. This presents a severe ethical bottleneck. We cannot achieve demilitarization if doing so means destroying the livelihoods of the millions of workers, researchers, and administrators trapped inside the death provisioning economy. John McMurtry's person-pattern distinction separates humans from the system's architecture. The outer layer holds individual role-bearers, machinists, soldiers, researchers, seeking livelihood within dependencies they didn't design. The core is the destructive pattern itself, command structures and laws capturing labor for extractive ends. Effective transition targets the systemic pattern rather than the captive worker. No life-destroying pattern is entitled to continue, but no worker caught inside it is dispensable. The practical application of this ethics model is life-coherent conversion. This is a deliberate redirection of capacity toward life, as opposed to simple disarmament or austerity. Disarmament removes the capacity for harm. Conversion redirects that capacity. The machinist working on missile components has the exact skills required to manufacture climate monitoring systems or water treatment infrastructure. The logistics expert coordinating troop deployments can manage disaster response networks. The technical capacity remains. The output changes. This flowchart maps the required structural transition. Moving an economy from death provisioning to life provisioning requires an organized, systemic pathway that treats the shift as a major industrial policy priority. The prerequisite for this process is economic security. Conversion must include strict worker income guarantees, robust retraining pipelines, and the establishment of regional transition authorities to ensure communities do not lose their tax bases during the shift. This bar chart compares the macroeconomic efficiency of these sectors using United Nations data. For every $1 billion spent, the military sector yields about 11,200 jobs. That same $1 billion generates 16,000 jobs in clean energy, 17,200 in healthcare, and nearly 27,000 in education. Conversion is not a sacrifice. It liberates human labor and industrial capacity from a low-yield, death-dependent sector, moving it into higher-yield fields that build societal resilience. We can initiate this transition immediately through existing financial levers, implementing peace-inclusive ESG standards, mandating pension fund transparency regarding weapons exposure, and executing deliberate public budget reallocation can begin decoupling civic institutions from the defense sector. This circular process diagrams the macro shift required. We must transition from a system of subsidized extraction to a comprehensive framework of life-ground protection, placing human dignity and ecological stability at the center of our definitions of security. This includes recognizing hard ecological thresholds. A military system that accounts for an estimated 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions while claiming to defend civilization is actively destabilizing the biosphere that civilization requires to exist. The contradiction has become too expensive to maintain. Society must cease using public budgets and state coercion to protect private asset claims at the direct expense of the living world. True security requires aligning our massive technological, financial, and industrial capabilities with one specific metric: the active protection and expansion of the conditions through which all life continues to flourish.